The second tiebreaker game of the 2016 World Chess Championship took place once again with the time control of 25 minutes plus the 10-second increment. Magnus Carlsen was white versus Sergey Karjakin as black, and this is what happened. E4 once again, although no Lopez this time. Carlsen proving the prediction by myself and Grandmaster Sasha Ipatov over on Chess Center, our daily post-game show during the World Championship, correct, in that the Italian would be chosen because of its flexibility. Tends to offer a little bit more freedom in terms of the theory, and especially after the structure like this is reached with d3. White has a lot of options. The queenside development is flexible with the move c3 coming that supports both b4 and d4. In some cases, the knight may still come to c3. Also, the next several moves are very flexible, whether you choose c3 or knight b to d2 or even h3. There's a lot of opportunities to create the kind of dynamic transposition you may want. And it also makes it harder for your opponent to have a completely mapped out defense. So the Italian is kind of like the 4d3 approach by White in the Berlin. But this game was no real surprise, nothing new. This position was played by both players in Game 5 of the World Championship, and after c3, d6. In that game, Magnus played the move b4, and after bishop a7, rook to e1, he wasn't necessarily happy with the opening transition, especially when Black was able to execute the following tactic by taking on e4 and getting the center fork, where White loses the material that he gained, and usually Black gets some activity that follows. So in this game, Carlsen actually didn't feel like he got anything with White out of the opening. So because of that, Carlsen decides to take a different approach here. And in game 2 of our tiebreaker, rather than playing the move 8b4, he plays the move 8 rook to e1. Again, looking for flexibility. Of course, the rook on e1 has a future, despite the fact that right now the file isn't open. He's looking to play d4 and pry things open. So the biggest issue here will become, will both sides have their pieces right where they want them once the pawn structure changes? Again, it's actually a tip I was just talking about in the video analysis to game 1, developing your pieces with an eye on not only the current position and are they in their most powerful, best defensive, whatever the criteria is, but also the direction you want the game to head. So both sides are going to be aware that at some point we're going to have a break in the center and things are going to change. So bishop a7 is played on that note, anticipating that Black doesn't want to deal with any tempo moves by White. h3 played as a good flexible defensive resource to guard the g4 square, both from a pin and from the potential of the knight coming into g4. After knight e7, we get the transition we talked about. But in this game, after c6 is played, Carlsen decides he's no longer interested in the center fork idea and decides to bring the bishop back to f1 immediately. a5 is played here, which is hard to have. It's hard to have heavy criticism for this move because it's not like it clearly weakens anything on the queen side, but it's probably not the best move in the position either, because depending on what happens here in the transition, if White ends up landing a knight on c4, it's going to be very difficult for Black to be able to justify b5 now that you've played a5. And the reason for that is that if you have full support of the b5 break, especially since the bishop's on a7, so there's no pin on the rook, this knight is never going to be permanently secure there. It's never comfortable because at some point Black will kick that knight out of an otherwise dominant square, right? But once a5 is played, now not only is there risk because in a lot of positions White can take on b5 and then gobble up the a5 pawn because the rook defends the knight, but it also makes the b5 pawn weak. In a lot of positions when b5 is played without the further support, if all that happens is a big trade and this knight does have to retreat, you also lose a little bit of protection on your b5 pawn. So kind of a strange decision by Karjakin to approach the queenside that way. My analysis, with some help from Grandmaster Robert Hess, is that probably rook e8 is the more solid move by Black. Now knight to c4, as an example, just doesn't work out very well because Black goes after this e4 pawn, and there's really nothing White can do about it. So that means the position kind of remains flexible. White has to figure out what to do with the center tension here before deciding to improve the knight. And you're going to see that that knight coming to c4 is a reality. It's exactly the plan that Carlsen executes, first by avoiding the queen trade, and then by bringing the knight to c4. And why is this such a good idea, and why has it been part of the storyline of the last several moves? Well, the d file is going to be the critical central open file, and so if I can control it, the d6 square is weak. Also, in the immediate sense, the e5 pawn is the most obvious target in black's position. So bringing the knight to c4 is a very common thing that white does in the Italian as soon as the bishop vacates the square. So if you're an Italian player or someone who plays e5 as black, that's just a good universal pro tip to take, that this kind of maneuver here where the knight comes to c4 is very common as soon as white has completed this retreat and frees open that square. So this plan we knew was coming from black, which is why we were a little bit questioning of this move, and why it seemed like maybe black should have been more flexible with rook e8. But all right, only a small advantage for Carlsen at this point in game 2. Nothing to write home about. The World Championship has not been decided, right? After queen to c7, we get the move b4, which is probably the most aggressive move Carlsen has had the chance to play in the last, week, at least since he won game 10 to tie the match in regulation. It's a move that shows his intentions are to use the space advantage he has, not to sit here and rely on just sort of a small, comfortable edge where, yes, white's a teensy-weensy bit better with better pieces, slightly more active pieces in the center. He wants to be aggressive. I mean, if you don't do anything, well, I'm immediately threatening to win the a5 pawn. But also there's possible threats of b5, and so it's a challenge to black's defensive setup on the queen side to figure out how you're going to deal with both the pawn hanging and the fact that I may advance. Now, the threat of advancing is not something right away that happens because, let's just say any move, if b5 is played, at some point here, the knight comes under fire because the queen and bishop double up. But it is still an idea, and of course a move like rook e8 isn't possible because the a5 pawn hangs anyway. So, how is Karjakin going to handle b4? Well, he took on b4, which makes sense. After the move c takes b4 is played, the big question becomes, and this is always a practical defensive question you have to ask yourself when you're the one who's not the aggressor, but your opponent is the right defense sort of sit and wait and actually sort of call their bluff? Is white really threatening anything concretely? Now that the c file is open, the idea I highlighted that white might play for b5 is a reality again because the knight is now protected enough times. There's also moves like bishop a3 coming, maybe bishop to e3 to remove the dark square bishop, and then I can continue sort of performing surgery on these dark squares. So it's an understandable approach that Karjakin took here, that he was struggling. Didn't like natural moves like this again, because I think both the idea of bishop b2 just developing and preparing further ideas of eventually getting b5. And I even like ideas like bishop e3 in some positions where the bishop can be traded and at some point white can try to use the dark squares. But Karjakin defended in the aggressive manner with b5, decided he couldn't sit tight and wait for either white to clamp down the dark squares or to play b5 himself. Probably in hindsight that was a second mistake. If a5 was the first mistake, the second queenside pawn move we're going to criticize is the move he played here. Probably rather than just sitting tight passively, but a move like knight h5 was really what black should have done here. Not to say black gets instant equality, but it seems like a natural plan for black and a lot of these Italians. If this knight does land on f4, it's always happy because it can't be kicked by g3. If the knight comes to f4 and you play g3, then the h3 pawn hangs, right? So knight h5 makes sense, and now the pressure is on Carlsen to come up with the right plan. I would suggest bishop e3, followed by continuing this idea on the dark squares, maybe a5 right away. Obviously, the engine above me seems to think a5 is best. I don't care so much about that. It seems like whatever move order white chooses, with the idea of at some point furthering the grip on the dark squares, using the queenside pawns, just to prove the point of why these things can go badly for someone if they just sit tight. I know I'm making bad moves, but let's say the moves that are being made aren't improving either. Eventually, this kind of thing is not just about the knight being dominant, but b5 is a threat because the c6 pawn is pinned to the queen, and you actually have what's really it's sort of a majority on the queen side. Technically, you have 2 pawns versus 2 pawns, but because of the difference in the pawns, right, white has the B and the A pawn, which makes this pawn a pretending passer, while black has the B and the C pawns. So the point is, if you just sit tight, if white plays B5, maybe white even gets A6, and there's a passed pawn. So it's very similar to like a grip pawn structure, where yes, the count is equal, but the space the pawns have gained and the opportunity for them to create aggressive chances to create a passed pawn is still there. And so it's not always the number of pawns you have, but the value of the pawns there. And so that's just an example of what might have been in black's future, or at least to show you why Karjakin was maybe a little nervous here. So he played b5, and after knight e3, we see the immediate issue is white is threatening to take on b5 in actually 2 ways because the c6 pawn is pinned. So he traded on a4 and then continued to make trades, with the goal being that he could eliminate some of white's threats. It's also possible that taking e3 was a mistake, and maybe this move analyzed by Robert is better, this move bishop to d4. But I'm not exactly sure I agree. I think after trading and taking here, this position is one where white has the bishop pair. White is not up a pawn or any concrete material yet, but the c6 pawn is probably the weakest pawn on the board. The d4 pawn is actually under fire right away, and further trades are only going to open the position up even more for the bishop. So I think this is a dangerous position for black regardless. And so in the game, Karjakin decided if he's going to lose the bishop for the knight, he's going to take first and then trade on a4 and try to be a little bit of the aggressor. But now we've got a situation where black is even more clearly in need to make something forceful happen, because if white is just able to sit on this position, what's an example? Well, first I can defend the e-pawn. Maybe I'll put my bishop on this really very nice c5 square. Then maybe I'll slowly gang up against this c6 pawn. One idea I might even consider is just give you the e4 pawn by putting my rook on c1 and trying to get a trade where I trade your c-pawn for my e-pawn, and at the end of a variation like that, I'm left with a passed b-pawn. So Carlsen is definitely the one in the driver's seat here with the white pieces, and it's because of that Karjakin decides he's willing to risk it and take e4 right away, which allows the tactics you see occur here with b5. Now you have threats where the queen has opened up her pressure on e4. This bishop is sort of being overwhelmed with duties to not only guard the knight, but also the c6 pawn. And b5 threatens something else, which is maybe just to punch b6 through and say, I'm just going to give up the e4 pawn and play for a pawn sacrifice. I believe the move Karjakin played here was the losing move in the game. And even though it was sort of justified, as other people felt that maybe he just thought he was just much worse here, and so didn't think he could continue to sit. I'm not sure I totally agree. I think that probably if he does retreat this knight to d6 and allow the variation with b6 that I already analyzed, queen to b7, bishop a6, queen to b8, I didn't see 100% of a clear knockout here for white. We went to the position with knight to d2, and okay, this is a very difficult position for black to play. You know white must be much better here and have a huge initiative because the material count is black is up a pawn, but look at the evaluation, right? The computer prefers white despite the fact that white is down the pawn, and that's because of the bishop pair. It's because of the very powerful passed b pawn. So, but with all those things said, I didn't exactly see a knockout blow. So again, if we go with a move like knight f4, and, you know, as black, you're inviting white to try to either trade off some of the pressure or to deal with activity here. I think there are probably a number of ways for white to maintain a small edge, but from my perspective, there's more flexibility in that position. I understand Karjakin being worried about the tactical pressure of the b-pawn and the bishop pair, but the forcing variations he now goes for with the move c takes b5 are the things that reach a lost position for black. The tactic here, the point of the whole thing is that white is taking on e4, an intermezzo. Of course, you can't take back because then I take your queen and you're just down a piece. So the forcing variation that occurs is one where white ends up with 2 pieces for a rook and a pawn. So is that lights out for black? No, but the evaluation, as you can see here, is much more for white than even compared to something that's a little more unclear. I know it's not exactly fair to reference the computer evaluation when halftime I'm telling you to ignore it if it doesn't agree with me, right? But I think that, and I already do agree that the evaluation before was only small for white, but I even said, like, you know white's better because the evaluation is small, but white's down a pawn. Here white isn't down any material, that's true, but it's just so difficult to defend a position where the minors have all day to remaneuver themselves and to find their best squares. Positions where the rooks can do well against the minor pieces. Okay? We can make notes. Positions with multiple passed pawns, where the rook can flex its muscles of swinging from one side of the board quickly to the other. With a rook, I can, defend your opponent's passed pawn and guard the 7th rank at the same time. I can defend the opponent's passed pawn and help my own pawn advance at the same time. Positions where you have both rooks are positions where the rooks can compete against the minors because now they can double up, whether that's on the 1st, 2nd, or a rank, or even on a file to really gang up against a target like a weak pawn. So there are positions where the rooks can play against the minors, but positions where all the pieces are on one side of the board, positions with no passed pawns, and positions with no, I would say, targets for the rooks, are positions where the minors will always outplay and beat the rooks. Now, will they win every time? That's another question. Excuse me, my microphone is dropping here, and I don't want to lose the feed here for everybody. So will they win every time? The answer is no, but it's certainly the one where it's a position where white has full control and is playing for 2 results, sort of 2.5 results, And that's why I provide the criticism I did there to Karjakin's approach, and why I don't agree with others that it I still feel like it was more of a blunder than it was a practical decision to just go for the rook versus the minors. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe Karjakin felt he actually had decent drawing chances here, since he eliminated the compensation with the B pawn. Maybe he valued the B pawn and the pressure there more than he does the potential for the minors to outplay him, but I think he was wrong. And after the move Queen F6, we get G3, Rook to C8, Bishop D3. All these moves are just so easy for white to play, and we're getting a position where the bishops they're looking good. The bishops are looking phenomenal. They're pointed toward the king side. And with the right approach here, white should be able to start getting an attack where the rook is just sitting idly by. That's the other danger of it being either a middle game or a position where all the pieces are on one side of the board. Is often the rook can't just go enter the fray of the 3rd, 4th, and 5th ranks against the minor pieces, because then he's liable to be lost for just one of them. Then you'll be down the exchange or down a piece. So if the rook can't compete, then that means in all the areas that matter, often your rook is, as I said, a bystander, just sort of watching. And here Carlsen really had a chance to show why that was the case with the move like knight h4. This would have been a move that really forces open the diagonals, and after you play bishop e4 with intermezzo, a fun example to show why a move like knight f3 check in between doesn't help things is because after takes and queen takes, white ends up checkmating black anyway on queen h8. So that's always a fun thing to do, is to review a line with checkmate. But let's say that black makes some other move and white captures back the knight. Even this is a position where Carlsen is in complete control. Super, super dangerous for black with the 2 bishops and the queen just peering down on you. And a game I would expect Carlsen to go on to win. So I think knight h4 was the more direct approach. Also analyzed was h4, and one of the key ideas there is that e4 doesn't actually win a piece, because after knight d4 with tempo and then bishop c2, this is also a position where white is just totally in the driver's seat. Threats, things like bishop to b3 hitting f7. In fact, it's hard to see how that threat is even stopped, where f7 and threats like queen takes g6 because the pawn is pinned to the king become a problem. So very, very difficult to see black defending this position. And unlike what happened in the game, if black tries to play a move like knight e7 to get out of it, in the game when this idea occurred, black was able to force a little bit more of the pieces off the board. Whereas here, black has no way to get rid of more pieces, the bishops and knights still working very well together. So either h4 or knight h4 would have been better for Carlsen. So a little bit surprising he played bishop e4, but even more surprising, and why, if you noticed, I chose my words very carefully a few minutes ago. I said that Karjakin played the moves that should have been losing, the losing moves of the game, but I didn't say he lost. In this position, still with a huge advantage, Carlsen should do anything that just keeps the pieces on the board. One really sexy tactic that the computer points out is bishop h7 check. Not a human move, but the point is you can't take it because I win the queen. And if you have to move the king to somewhere like h8, well, now the problem is the bishop comes back, and I'm reinvigorated in my attack with threats like knight to g5 because of f7 hanging. So just a very, very dangerous, precarious position for black. For some reason, Magnus didn't have the wherewithal to figure out the tactics. But what doesn't make sense on a practical level is not that he didn't see the win, or not that he didn't see the engine's idea, but that he decided to trade queens and go to an endgame where not only do the queens come off the board, but immediately another set of pieces come off the board, decreasing the chances that the minors can ever fully coordinate and now play the rook. Now, all of that said, this position is still winning. And I still haven't said the game was a draw or that Carlsen didn't win. Stay on the edge of your seats. But if you're evaluating or you're going with Danny's theory of little mistakes lead to bigger mistakes, and eventually you're looking back at a game where you can totally beat yourself up with the one blunder that didn't win you the game, but choosing the wrong plan, 10 moves before that, or not properly assessing something about the pawn structure or the goal position you want for your king in the endgame. And I could go on and on with some sort of abstract teaching point. The point is, very often when you blundered, it's because you chose a plan that wasn't ideal, or you got yourself in a less than ideal situation. And so I think that even though Carlsen still goes on to achieve a winning position here, it just doesn't make sense that he traded queens, especially when he had like 5 minutes. Karjakin was under 1 minute left in the game, so Karjakin's living off the increment. Carlsen has all the time in the world and tons of threats against the king. Trading queens just would have not been my first decision. That leads us to a whole bunch of really forced moves where, in order to win this endgame, White's going to have to activate the king. And if White can do that and eventually get this king on one of these squares, whether that's f7 or g6, and let's say nothing else has changed, then White should be winning. So could Carlsen do that? Let's see. He does improve the position. He does get the king close to those squares I just highlighted. But I said, is he going to be able to do it without really changing anything about the position? Well, that's really the key. He does eventually get his king to g6, but he decides at this moment he's going to risk it and give up the f2 pawn in order to get the most powerful position for the king. The problem I have is, even though, again, Carlsen is still in a winning position with the king there, and even with the loss of the f-pawn, Black is likely still lost. It just starts to give you this feeling that, again, Carlsen is not in form, right? He trades queens when he's got the attack and he's up 5 minutes on time with his opponent under increment. Now he sort of sloppily gives up the f-pawn in order to get the king where it belongs, when probably there's nothing stopping the king from getting there anyway, right? You can gain a tempo on the rook, and likely you're going to be headed into this square no matter what. So it doesn't seem unnecessary that this pawn was given up, but Carlsen did it, and indeed he still does reach a position that should be winning right here, right now. But this is maybe the last moment where I actually get to say the position was probably winning. This position was, and the whole plan that Carlsen launched over the last 10-15 moves to bring up the king is all based around one idea. This pawn must fall. If the bishop reaches f8, the pawn on g7 will fall, and with it everything goes. The problem is, now without your f-pawn guarding the g-pawn, well, if you move your bishop to some random square, well, now the rook comes back to g2 in a lot of scenarios, and you're not threatening anything. You can't move the bishop in because the pawn hangs. You can't play g4 because your bishop isn't protecting it. So you might just come back to e6, and just like that, we're back to square one. So Carlsen was a little bit thrown off by his inability to just achieve the ideal setup of the two bishops on these squares, where basically you're taking on g7 for checkmate. But in that process of losing his cool, he, for some reason, chose probably the one way to really allow Black to get back to the optimal defensive setup, and having stolen this pawn like a bandit in the night, right, in the process. And that was with this horrible move, bishop to g4. Might even be worth 2 question marks. Karjakin took 0 time and immediately played rook to e8, preventing bishop f8, and all the fans, everybody knew, even lower levels knew something had gone wrong here for White, because all that effort was done to get the king there, and you risked the rook getting sort of uncoordinated on f2 for the chances that he shouldn't be able to get back and reestablish an optimal defensive setup. But he was able to do that just like this. So, again, the winning idea here, and the line that in certain variations have the computers almost announcing mates, is the move king f7. Now, one of the points is, if the rook just sits, let's say, the rook just sits and waits, okay, you probably play g4 before bishop f8, just because it just makes sense to kind of grind it. And the point is that if you get a position even further, now black is really busted. As you see, the evaluation just jumps sky high, because the point is black is in zugzwang. He can't do anything to stop bishop f7, which is going to be mate on g7. And if he starts sacrificing pawns, it just doesn't matter. You're just capturing everything. Moves like h5 don't help. Probably here you could play either bishop f7. Some of the computer announces mate in 26 with f6. I don't even see it. I would just go with the human move, I think. And just play the move bishop to f7, even though at first the computer does. I mean, that just makes sense. Cut off the rook, win h5. So this position is going to be winning with the king getting to f7. But for whatever reason, Carlsen lost his cool, played bishop g4, and just like that, we spend the next several moves with white struggling to get back to that same setup where he can actually execute in with a move like bishop f8 without either losing the g3 pawn or allowing the rook to check on the sides. And you'll see there really ends up never being a possibility to do it. Again, now if the bishop comes in to f8, the g3 pawn falls. Can't quite get the setup, so he plays g4, which makes sense. The rook comes to c6 because bishop f8 can be met by check, and then king over. Still, white is just not quite in the optimal setup that white needs in order to get the f7 pawn. If you come back to e6 now, rook to b6 wins a piece. So still, it's just a little bit of a struggle. King to g8, the bishop comes back. Again, the bishop came back to e6, king f7 came back, bishop to e7. And now Karjakin recognized that he didn't even want to sit here and let Carlsen try to beat him under time pressure, but actually calculated a forcing draw by sacrificing the h-pawn, forcing it to become a corner pawn, and then, do you know your theoretical endgames? That's right, he just gives up the rook for the bishop. First f5, make the bishop take it, and then just give it up, and this is an easily drawn endgame because you have two corner pawns that are the wrong color of the bishop, so the position is just a draw. Carlsen forces the stalemate. Even if Carlsen just sits, there's no way to force the king out, the wrong color corner pawn. And so here we get a nice little finish with he sacrifices the g5 pawn for en passant, which leads to an immediate stalemate. So a fascinating, mind-blowing game. This is no trick. This is how game 2 of the tiebreakers ended. Amazing to see just such incredibly resourceful defense by Karjakin. I mean, seriously, he was lost probably from about move 35 on after this transition into the two pieces for the rook. It was a matter of technique, and there's one person in the world who I would take in those kind of scenarios over everybody else most of the time, and that's Magnus Carlsen. But his form is just not quite there, remains to be something that he's searching for. The queen trade was off. The slight misevaluation of that he needed to give up the f pawn to get the king to g6 was off, but even after all that, it was still winning. And somehow in the end, he just miscalculates with bishop to g4, allowing the rook back to e8. So Karjakin gets all the credit in the world. The challenger is once again proving that he is strong like bull, and he holds the position. Позиция. Sorry for that instant. I don't know where that came from, but also that Carlsen is struggling to play the high-quality chess that he knows he's capable of. So fascinating stuff. What matters is we move on to Game 3 of the 2016 World Chess Championship, still completely gridlocked in an even score, and we look forward to you watching that video next.